Surrender 2nd edition, a used 2 rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx1. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. 2 Any Edition Living Rules Designers Edition. Unconditional Surrender. Pilot, Salvatore Vasta Co-pilot, Mark Day Flight Engineer, Alan Hill. Table of Contents. 1.0 General Information. 2.2.0 Country and Factions. 6.3.0 Markers and Units. 7.4.0 Movement. 8.5.0 Combat. 12.6.0 Actions. 17.7.0 Supply. 24.8.0 Unit Logistics. 27.9.0 Economy. 28.10.0 Politics. 30.11.0 Weather. 34. 12.0 Turn Completion. 34. 13.0 Conditional Events. 35.14.0 Event Markers. 39.15.0 Tracking Markers. 42.16.0 Country List. 46.17.0 Disputed Area List. 46 Index. 47. Policies Quick Reference. 49 Policies Quick Reference. 50 Conditional Events Quick Reference. 51 Operations Phase Flowchart. 53 Sequence of Play Flowchart. 54. 2 Unconditional Surrender 2 Any Edition Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. Sequence of Play 1.2. In faction order, each faction completes one phase before the next phase is started. Exceptions, Weather and Strategic Warfare Phases. Faction order is Axis, Western, and Soviet. Weather phase Axis faction determines the turn's weather. Declare war phase if allowed, factions may declare war on neutral countries. Economy phase determine production points for each country. Strategic Warfare phase Axis faction determines the effect of strategic warfare. Strategic Movement phase an air or ground unit moves using strategic movement. Operations phase Actions subphase, units perform actions to move and fight. Supply check subphase, units trace a supply line. Each faction completes both subphases of the operations phase before the next faction starts its operations phase. No supply phase unsupplied units are reduced in strength or eliminated. Replacements phase factions may pay to increase reduced strength ground units to full strength and remove up to 2 sorties each from air and naval units. Upgrade phase units on the map may be replaced by upgrade units that are in their faction card's upgrade box. Mobilization phase factions may pay to take units in their faction card's mobilization box and place them onto the map. Diplomacy phase factions work with diplomacy-related event markers. Victory check phase check if victory conditions have been achieved. End of turn phase advance the turn marker 1 turn. Place counters from the new turn box in their respective locations. Move all units in a faction card's eliminated box to its mobilization box. 1.0 General Information. 1.1 Introduction. Unconditional Surrender. World War II in Europe, referred to as USE, is a 2 to 4 player strategic level game covering World War II's European theater. Players control the political decisions and military forces of the Axis, Western, and Soviet factions that struggled for European dominance and survival. USE has scenarios ranging from individual campaigns to the entire war. See the playbook for a listing. 1.1.1 Objective: have fun playing. After that, achieve the victory conditions as set forth in the scenario being played. 1.1.2 Writing style. Some words are italics to emphasize their importance. Rules marked important or exception are ones to pay significant attention to. A rules number cross-reference or an acronym for a group of words appears in parentheses, such as a 1.2 or EZOC. Important notes are highlighted in blue shaded boxes. Game designer comments appear in italics, usually in tan shaded boxes. A rules exception is usually enclosed in brackets. Exception. Examples are in italics. Examples and comments may help in understanding a rule. Nouns are generally written in the singular form. A phrase such as the unit does not limit the rule to 1 unit. When a numerical limit is imposed, a number will be used, for example, 1 country. A step labeled procedure is performed in numeric sequence. Each step is completed before the next higher step is performed. Text in blue color are corrected or new rules. They only appear in updated living rules versions of the respective component. Underlined numbers in brown color are hyperlinks to that respective rule in the electronic version of this book. 1.1.3 Learning the game. Rules are grouped around a common procedure or concept, for example, movement. You may choose to learn the game by reading the rulebook from cover to cover, while having the faction cards and player aid sheet with you, or by using one of the different ways found in the playbook's alternate learning methods. 30.1. Due to the game's unique mechanics and low counter density relative to other strategic WW2 war games, the training scenarios method is recommended. If you prefer to read the rules while having some components on the map, set up the France 1940 scenario. 31.3. 1.1.4 Components. 1 rulebook. 1 playbook. 222 x 34 maps. 840 counters on 3 counter sheets. 311 x 17 player aid sheets. 38.5 x 11 faction cards. 38.5 x 11 flowchart cards. 3 6-sided dice. Unconditional Surrender 2nd Edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 V03.docx3. Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. Rulebook. The rules in this book apply to all scenarios unless noted otherwise within a specific scenario. If a rules disagreement arises that cannot be resolved through discussion, roll a die. High roller wins. It's a game, folks. Flowcharts. Flowcharts follow the sequence of play and operations phase to help you while playing the game. Playbook. The playbook contains the specific rules and setup instructions for the scenarios included in the game. Faction cards. Each faction has its own faction card. Alternatively, players may use the other side of two of them, one of which has the production and national wall tracks for all factions, and the other which has faction cards for all factions. Player aid sheet. The player aid sheet contains many tables used in the game. 1.1.5 scale use is not a detailed case study of WW2. It simulates relative force projection rather than actual quantities of men and equipment. You may not see an air or naval unit somewhere on the map, but that does not mean no planes or ships are there. It means their impact is minimal at the game scale. Turn. Each turn represents one calendar month. Unit. A ground unit is represented at the army level, but may consist of forces ranging from a brigade to a full army. An air or naval unit is represented as a group, fleet, or other designation. Map. The map covers the European continent, portions of Africa, and the Middle East. A hex represents about 30 to 40 miles of 50 to 65 kilometers. The map does not use the common Mercator projection. It is a Lambert-style equal area projection that fits uses scale and game mechanics. 1.1.6 dice, and DM the game uses 6-sided dice to resolve some mechanics. The result of a die roll may be modified by a die roll modifier of DM. You add or subtract the DM to arrive at the final result. Rounding. If instructed to round up, a fractional value is increased to the next higher whole number. If instructed to round down, a fractional value is decreased to the prior lower whole number. Example. For strategic combat, the Soviet faction receives +1 DM per 3 allied countries conquered by Axis. Round up. If the Axis conquered 2 countries, the DM is +1 and 2 3 equals 0.67. If it conquered 4, the DM is +2 4 3 equals 1.33. 1.2 Sequence of play. The sequence of play list is found on page 2 of this rulebook for easy reference. A game turn follows a specific sequence of play, made up of phases and possibly subphases. The faction performing its part in the sequence of play is referred to as the phasing faction. The other factions are referred to as the non-phasing factions. In use, a non-phasing faction will have opportunities to interact while the phasing faction is playing. Important, each faction completes one phase in the faction order listed before the next faction completes that same phase. Faction order is Axis, Western, and Soviet. Example, in the no-supply phase, the Axis faction reduces all its unsupplied units first, followed by the Western faction, and then the Soviet faction. The Axis faction then starts the replacements phase. Exceptions, only the Axis faction performs the weather phase and strategic warfare phase. The diplomacy phase is skipped unless one or more of these policies are in effect: appeasement, Nazi-Soviet pact, or Moscow Treaty. The operations phase has 2 subphases: actions and supply check. In faction order, one faction completes both subphases before the next faction starts its operations phase. 1.2.1 Operations use does not use a move everyone, fight everyone a system. Instead, a faction activates one unit to move and or fight possibly multiple times within a single activation. When the faction completes that unit's activation, it then activates another unit. The operations phase is when air, ground, and naval units move, fight, and check if they can trace a supply line. It is also when a faction checks that its countries are satisfying the home defense policy, 10.3.1. It also checks for the home defense policy at the start of its strategic movement phase of 4.1.1. Action subphase. At the start of its action subphase, if the home defense policy, 10.3.1, is in effect, the phasing faction checks to see if any friendly country is not satisfying that policy. If it is not, see home defense not satisfied, 10.3.1.1. After that, the phasing faction may perform actions 6.0 with its units. When all actions are done, remove any airdrop, assault, partisans, or surprise attack markers in a hex or C-zone. See the markers rule to determine where it goes. Supply check subphase. After completing its actions subphase, the phasing faction checks if its units in a hex can trace a supply line. 7.4. 1.3 Map. The following are key elements and rules related to the map. 1.3.1 Capital, city, factory, port. See the terrain key on the map to identify which symbol represents a capital, city, factory, or port. The distinctions are important for different game mechanics. City. A hex with one or more of these symbols is considered to have a city in it: capital, city, factory, or port. Granity. This reference location in Sicily is not a city, and is ignored for all game purposes. It's there because that is where the designer's parents are from. It's good to be the designer. 1.3.2 Faded. Hex. A hex that is faded in color, and has a dot in the middle is called a faded hex. Example, hexes 1805 and 5640. A faded hex is prohibited for ground movement and amphibious invasion, but is allowed for air and naval movement. Example, a USSR ground unit in Batum Hex 4058 can amphibiously invade Samsun Hex 4052, but not Hex 4153. For Unconditional Surrender 2 any edition use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. Some areas, such as Scandinavia, had too little infrastructure to support a large number of ground forces. By prohibiting ground movement in them, the quantity of units, and their operations fall more within historical limits. 1.3.3 Other hex hexide definitions Coastal hex, a land hex that has land and water in it, and the water area of the hex is part of a sea zone. Example, hexes 1640 to 1642 are coastal hexes, 1742 is not. Island, a land hex that is either alone or part of a group of hexes which are surrounded by water hexides. In addition, none of its land hexes contain a transport line. Example, Malta and Crete are islands. Sicily is not because it contains a transport line. Rough hex, a hex that has desert, hills, woods, or swamp terrain in it, either fully or partially. Example, hexes 1739, 1840, and 1940 are rough hexes. Land hex hexide, a hex or hexide that has land terrain in it, either fully or partially. Water hex hexide, a hex or hexide that has only water. Example, hexes 1642, 1742, and 1841 are land hexes. Example, hex 1542 is a water hex, 1642 is not. Hexide 1742, 1743 is a water hexide, 1642, 1743 is not. 1.3.4 Land border A land border is an international or disputed border hexide that has some amount of land and is shared by two countries. A border hexide crossed by a strait is not a land border. Example, hexide 2714, 2715 is a land border, 2125, 2126 is not. 1.3.5 Map box Each of the following is considered a map box: Arabian Sea, Central Russia, North Atlantic Ocean, Eastern North America, South Atlantic Ocean, and Western Indian Ocean. Naval movement or a supply line trace is allowed directly between map boxes if an arrow connects both boxes. Example, a unit can move from the North Atlantic Ocean directly to Eastern North America. It cannot go directly to the Western Indian Ocean. It must first go to the South Atlantic Ocean box, and then continue. Naval movement is allowed directly between a map box and an adjacent sea zone listed within that map box. Example, a unit can move from the Arabian Sea to either sea zone 31 or 32. Ground or air movement is allowed between the eastern map edge within the USSR and the Central Russia box. Combat, air interception a 6.2.5, or naval interception a 6.4.3 cannot occur in a map box. 1.3.6 Sea zone A sea zone is a group of water and or coastal hexes encompassed by a sea zone border and or a strait symbol. Example, the straits by Denmark and Sweden separate sea zones 12 and 13. A sea zone also has a large identification number in it. If the same sea zone number appears twice, it is to show that those hexes are in the same sea zone. Example, sea zone 12 near Denmark and 13 near Sweden. If a sea zone border or strait runs into or ends at a hex, that hex is in more than one sea zone. In most cases, the end of a sea zone border will extend onto hexides to more easily identify such a multizone hex. Examples, a sea zone border runs into hexes 1540 and 1639. Each hex is in sea zone 14 and 33. A sea zone border ends at Antwerp's hex. That hex is part of sea zones 10 and 11. A strait runs into the Gibraltar and Tanya hexes. Each hex is in sea zone 16 and 17. Inland port, a port that is not in a coastal hex is part of a sea zone. Example, London in hex 2611 is in sea zone 10. 1.3.7 Transport line A transport line refers to either a rail dashed or road a solid line running through a hex on the map. Rules-wise there is no difference between them. They are for historical reference. A transport line provides a benefit in ground movement 4.2.3.4 and may be required to trace a supply line 7.4. 1.3.8 Prohibited country Persia, Saudi Arabia, and Switzerland hexes are prohibited to all units, and these countries cannot be activated or selected for any purpose. Doing this mitigated unusual gameplay occurrences. 1.3.9 Weather zones Each weather zone on the map is separated by a weather line. All hexes in a weather zone are affected by its current weather. Cold zone contains hexes north of the blue line. Mild zone contains hexes between the green and blue lines. Warm zone contains hexes between the yellow and green lines. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx5. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. Desert Zone contains hexes south of the yellow line. The 1st of March 2010 USSR restricted hexes only a USSR unit or marker can move, retreat, trace a path, or be placed in a USSR hex east of hexes 1458, 1558, 1657, 1757, 2159, 2258, 2359, and 2459. Other USSR hex rows are not restricted. Note that a USSR unit cannot be attacked while in these hexes, but a USSR unit can attack out of them. If the Axis has done extremely well in the USSR, which should be rare, this rule prevents it from unrealistically sealing off the east map edge from the central Russia box. 1.4 range. Some activities require counting out a range of hexes, C zones, or map boxes. Besides being stated in those rules, the player aid sheet's ranges table lists those activities, and their ranges. When counting out a range of hexes from a counter, do not include that counter's hex. Example, a 5 hex range from an air unit in hex 3055 goes out to, and includes hex 3060. Even though it is not counted, the counter's location is part of that range. Example continued, hex 3055 is within the range. A faded dot hex can be counted as part of a range of hexes. When counting out a range of C zones or map boxes, count the location containing the counter you are tracing from. Example, a range of 2 C zones from a naval unit in Malta includes C zone 22 and an adjacent C zone. Unless otherwise restricted, a range of C zones can trace across a strait or through a canal without penalty. 1.5 sorties. The effectiveness of an air or naval unit is tracked using sorties markers, valued at 1 through 6. A unit with no sorties is fully effective. A unit with 6 sorties cannot be activated. As an air or naval unit conducts actions, or is involved in combat, it will add sorties to its total. When an air or naval unit receives replacements at 8.1, it reduces sorties from its total. When a unit adds or reduces its sorties, put the respective sorties marker equal to the total on the unit, or under the unit, whichever you prefer. Just be consistent. Example, a unit with 2 sorties suffers a combat result that adds 2 sorties. Replace the 2 sorties marker with a 4 sorties marker. The highest sorties value a unit can be marked with is 6, even if it suffers a total greater than 6. 1.6 Turn counting. When you are instructed to put a counter a certain number of turns later on a track, do not count the current turn. Example, it is the June 41 turn. To put the USA entry marker 6 turns later on the turn track, place it in the December 41 box. 1.7 Zone of control. A ground unit exerts a zone of control, ZOC, into each of the 6 adjacent hexes around its current location. More than one ZOC from different units can be exerted into the same hex. Exceptions, a unit occupying a fort, i.e., under a fort marker, does not exert any ZOC. An enemy ZOC is exerted into a hex with a fort. No ZOC is exerted into or across a ground movement prohibited hex or hexide. Player aid sheet, movement table. Example, if appeasement is in effect, an Axis unit's ZOC does not extend into a Western country, and vice versa. No enemy ZOC is exerted into a hex with a no ZOC marker. No ZOC is exerted into or out of a map box. 1.7.1 Enemy zone of control. A ZOC exerted by an enemy unit is referred to as an enemy zone of control, EZOC. An EZOC may affect movement, supply, and retreats in combat. The effects are found below, and within their respective rule. 1.7.1.1 EZOC effects summary. Air movement prohibitions. 4.2.2.1 An air unit cannot end its movement in hex containing an EZOC unless the hex contains a friendly, city, fort, or unit. Amphibious invasion resolution 6.3.2.4 If the invading ground unit is in an EZOC, it must either end its activation or immediately resolve an assault attack against an enemy ground unit in an adjacent hex. Ground movement prohibitions 4.2.3.2 A ground unit cannot enter a hex containing a friendly ground unit and an EZOC. Ground movement EZOC restrictions 4.2.3.1 4.2.3.1 Examples for these restrictions appear in Rule 4.2.3.1. A unit cannot move directly between hexes which contain an EZOC exerted by the same enemy unit. At the start of its activation, a unit in an EZOC can move into a hex containing an EZOC exerted by a different unit, provided that move does not violate the same unit EZOC rule above. At the start of its activation, a unit in an EZOC can move into hex containing no EZOC, and then later move into a hex containing an EZOC exerted by any unit, even the enemy unit that exerted the original EZOC. 6. Unconditional Surrender 2 Any edition Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 V03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. Very important, at any point during its activation, except at the start of its activation as per above, if a ground unit is in a hex containing an EZOC, it must do one of the following. End its activation. If the hex contains a fort of the same nationality, and the unit did not occupy the fort earlier in the turn, it may occupy the fort before ending its activation. If it has not performed a mobile attack in this activation, it can designate an assault of 5.3.3 against an adjacent enemy ground unit. If it designates an assault, the unit's activation ends. It can initiate a mobile attack of 5.3.2 against an adjacent enemy ground unit that does not occupy a fort of 4.2.3.5. It can do this even if it had resolved another mobile attack in the same activation, and even against the same enemy unit. Remember to pay all the movement costs for each attack. No EZOC marker 15.17 A no EZOC is exerted into a hex containing a no EZOC marker. Retreat prohibitions 5.3.5.1 A unit cannot retreat into a hex containing an EZOC unless it contains a friendly, city or fort, and the unit is also putting a 1 hex gap between it and the attacker. Strategic movement prohibitions 4.1.3 The moving unit cannot enter an EZOC. It can start in an EZOC. Supply line prohibitions 7.4.1. A supply line trace cannot enter an East Ocean unless it contains a friendly, city, fort, or ground unit. 2.0 Country and factions. 2.1 Country. A country is a group of land hexes encompassed by an international border. All countries have a mainland area. Some countries also have an overseas area, which is any territory not considered a mainland area. Example, Greece consists of the mainland area of Greece and the overseas area of Crete. The country list of 16.0 has information based on 1939 borders for each country's mainland and overseas areas, number of factories, and national will. 2.1.1 Active inactive country. A country is considered active or inactive. An active country has joined a faction and has units in play. An inactive country is neutral, conquered, or ceded in its entirety to another country. It has no units in play. 2.1.1.1 Neutral country. A neutral country may activate, during a scenario, due to declare war 10.1, a conditional event of 13.0, or diplomacy 10.2. If a country activates, see country activation a 13.1. A neutral country is not considered part of any faction a 2.3. No movement, retreat, movement path trace, nor supply line trace can include a hex in a neutral country. 2.1.2 National will. National will represents a country's willingness to continue fighting. A country's starting national will is listed in a scenario's instructions, and it may vary during play. Will markers. National will is tracked using a country's will markers on its faction's national will track. A will 1's marker is put in the 1's row. A will 10's marker, if any, is put in the 10's row. A country's national will cannot exceed 99, and it cannot be less than 0. If a country's national will drops to 0, it collapses a 13.2. A collapsed country that has at least one of its cities under enemy control is considered conquered a 13.2.2. 2.1.2.1 National will effects. Per the player age sheet's national will effects table, some events cause a country's national will to decrease or increase. National will is affected immediately when these events occur, and its will markers are moved on the track accordingly. If you forget to do that and cannot easily fix it, just play on and have fun. Example, France's national will is 15. A German ground unit eliminates a French field ground unit in Paris. Before the German unit advances after combat, France's national will is reduced by 1 to 14. Then, after the German ground unit advances into Paris, France's capital goes under enemy control, and its national will is decreased by 4 more down to 10. 2.2 Disputed area. A disputed area is a group of land hexes encompassed by a disputed and/or international border, for example, Eastern Poland. The hexes in a disputed area may start a scenario as part of one country, but may be ceded to another country due to an area seized event 14.2, or if its country is conquered a 13.2.2. The disputed area list of 17.0 has information for each disputed area, the country it is part of, and the country it may be ceded to. When an area is ceded, put its ceded a disputed area marker in its faction card's ceded area box. Use does not have a disputed area that can be ceded to a Western country. However, the Western faction card has a ceded area box in case of official game expansions or unofficial player modifications. If the area was ceded to the USSR, raise its national will as per the player age sheet's national will effects table. When a disputed area is ceded, all hexes immediately become and remain for the rest of the scenario part of the mainland area of the country they were ceded to. All cities in that area which do not contain an enemy unit are now under the control of its new country. This could increase that country's factory count. Example, the area seized event causes the Bessarabia disputed area of a Romania to be ceded to the USSR. All hexes and cities in Bessarabia are now part of the USSR for the rest of the scenario. Since Kishinev is a factory, the USSR's factory count is increased by 1 and Romania's is decreased by 1. If Romania were to later take control of Kishinev, Romania's factory count would not increase because Kishinev would still be a factory in an enemy country in 9.1.2. If a city contains an enemy unit, it is now under the control of the enemy unit's faction. Put the respective control faction a marker in the hex and lower the new owning country's national will as per the national will effects table. 2.2.1 Disputed areas. Special cases. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, each of these countries is considered a disputed area. Once ceded, that country ceases to exist, and its units and markers are removed from the scenario. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx7. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. Occupied France, occupied USSR, and Vichy, these are not disputed areas. The disputed border is used to denote new borders. 2.3 Factions. There are 3 factions in the game, Axis, Western, and Soviet. The Axis faction consists of countries allied with Germany. The Western faction consists of countries allied with the United Kingdom UK. The Soviet faction consists of countries allied with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics USSR. Players separately control these factions in the game. The number of factions involved in a scenario is based on the scenario played. If a rule or marker states allied, then it applies to either or both of the Western and Soviet factions. Friendly enemy, a unit, marker, or city that belongs to, or is under the control of, one faction is friendly to all units and markers of that faction. If it belongs to a different faction, it is an enemy to that faction. Therefore, Axis, Western, and Soviet factions are enemy to each other. Example, a USSR unit is an enemy unit to both the Axis and Western factions. A country, even if it is conquered, is always considered part of the faction that it joined. The Central Russia map box is friendly to the Soviet faction. All other map boxes are friendly to the Western faction. A pro-faction marker is friendly enemy based on its listed faction. However, it does not belong to a faction. Example, a pro-Axis marker is Axis friendly, but putting one in a neutral Belgium does not trigger the West invaded conditional event, 13.8. 2.3.1 City control. A city is under the control of one faction at a time, i.e., it is friendly to the Axis, Western, or Soviet faction. The control of a city immediately changes if an enemy ground unit moves into the hex. It may also change as a result of an airdrop action, a 6.1.2. When a city's control changes, put or remove the respective control faction marker in the hex. If needed, adjust the respective country's national will as per the national will effects table. 3.0 Markers and units. A counter is either a unit or a marker. They are different from each other, so rules are specific to each type. Markers track economic, military, or political conditions. Units represent military forces. If a counter specifically belongs to a country or faction, its country name abbreviation is on the bottom of the counter. What if a counter with a triangle symbol is a what if counter. These counters are not listed in US's playbook scenarios. They have been provided in case of official game expansions or unofficial player modifications. Use at your own discretion. 3.1 Markers. There are two kinds of markers, event of 14.0, and tracking of 15.0. A list of each marker is found in its respective rules section. A marker may have one or more of the following reminder symbols on them. A small die indicates to roll a die after using the marker, and put the marker that many turns later on the turn track. Exception, airdrop of 14.1. A hash P indicates the number of production points it costs to buy back the marker in the mobilization phase. A hash T indicates that after using it, the marker is put the listed number of turns later on the turn track. An S+1 indicates that after using it, the marker is put on the turn track a number of turns later equal to its total sorties +1. 3.2 Units. Unlike some other wargames, use does not use combat factors to rate the fighting effectiveness of different units and nationalities. Instead, those qualities are reflected in various die roll modifiers. Also, there is no movement factor number on the counters, as there are only two values to remember, 8 and 10, 8 for leg ground units, and 10 for every other kind of unit. There are three kinds of units, air, ground, and naval. Within each kind there are different types or other distinctions. The distinction between the different types of units, for example, fighter or bomber air units, is based on the predominant equipment and tactics used. It is not the only type of equipment in that unit. The center of a unit's counter contains a NATO military symbol or an image. The symbol or image indicates the unit's type, as does the text on the reverse side. An historical IE appears along one side of a unit's counter, left for air, top for naval, right for ground. Unless specifically required, for example, to identify a shock unit, the IE has no impact on play. A unit with a star symbol is considered an elite unit, and receives the elite unit combat DM on a combat DM list, a player aid sheet. Example, in ground combat, a USSR shock ground unit receives the +1 elite unit DM. 3.2.1 Air units. There are two types of air units, fighter and bomber. Fighter bomber. A fighter or bomber can attack an air or naval unit, or provide air support to a ground combat. A fighter can also escort or intercept an air or naval unit. A bomber can also bomb a factory. Unlike a ground unit, an air unit does not have strength sides. 3.2.2 Ground units. There are two categories of ground units, field and garrison. Both categories may move and attack other ground units. Field, full strength, reduced strength. A field unit has two different sides to indicate the strength of the unit. A full strength side has no stripe across the bottom of the counter, a reduced strength side has a stripe at the bottom across its nationality name. 8. Unconditional Surrender 2. Any edition use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. A reduced strength unit represents forces of significantly lower quality and or quantity. Garrison, reduced strength. A front side only. The garrison unit has only one side, and is always considered a reduced strength unit. 3.2.2.1 Ground unit types. Ground units are broken down into two types, leg and mobile. Within each type there are different subtypes which are identified by the NATO military symbol on the counter. Leg, infantry paratroop garrison. Mobile, motorized tank. 3.2.3 Naval units. There are two categories of naval units, warship and convoy. A warship unit can attack, escort, or intercept a naval unit. It can also provide naval support in an amphibious invasion. A convoy unit is used for supply or naval transport purposes. Carrier surface convoy. There are two types of warship units, carrier and surface. Only a carrier can perform the carrier strike action, a 6.4.5. Otherwise, there is no difference in the actions they can perform. Unlike a ground unit, a naval unit does not have strength sides. 3.3 Stacking limit. Stacking refers to having more than one counter in a hex. Stacking has to do with assigned areas of operation, not manpower. A reduced ground unit may have fewer soldiers than a full strength unit, but two reduced units cannot occupy the same hex. The same concept applies to air or naval units. Markers have no stacking limit, and they do not impact the stacking limit of units. Units do have stacking limits. A hex can have one of each of the following units: bomber, convoy, fighter, ground, and warship. This stacking limit cannot be violated at any point in a turn. Exceptions. A ground unit can temporarily violate stacking if it is moving through, i.e., not ending in the hex containing another friendly unit, and there is no enemy zone of control, adjacency, in that hex. An air or naval unit can temporarily violate stacking if it is moving through, i.e., not ending in the hex containing another friendly air or naval unit, regardless of any adjacency in that hex. Stacking limits are ignored when tracing a supply line. Examples: German infantry units are in hexes 2915, 3015, and 3116, 1 in each hex. German air units are in hexes 3015 and 3016, 1 in each hex. A French infantry unit is in Paris. The German infantry unit in 3015 can move into hex 3116, which is not in an adjacency, and then continue moving. It cannot move into and through 2915, because 2915 has both a friendly ground unit and an adjacency from the unit in Paris. It could not do this even if it moved out of the adjacency in 3015 by first moving into hex 2916. Using the same setup, the German air unit in 3016 can move into 3015, and then continue moving. It cannot end movement there. Using the same setup, the German unit in 3015 can trace a supply line through hex 2915 or 3116. Subject to the above restrictions, friendly units of different countries can stack. There is no stacking limit in a map box 1.3.5. However, for purposes of naval transport or providing escort, units in a map box can be considered stacked within stacking limits, as the owning faction chooses. Example: the following USA units are in the Eastern North. America box, 2 convoy, 1 warship, and 2 ground units. The Western player can create 2 separate stacks with those units in order to move to Great Britain. Important: enemy units cannot share the same hex. A ground unit can move into a hex containing an enemy air or naval unit and no enemy ground unit, but that will force the air or naval unit to immediately move out of the hex 4.2.3.7. Exceptions. An air unit can temporarily share a hex if it is moving through, i.e., not ending in the hex containing an enemy counter. Axis and Soviet units may temporarily share a hex while performing steps related to a USSR collapse 13.2.1.1. 4.0 Movement. Important: the player aid sheet's movement table lists information related to unit movement points, movement point costs, and prohibited hexes. There are 2 kinds of movement: strategic and operational. Strategic movement only occurs in the strategic movement phase. Unlike operational movement, it does not cost movement or production points, and it does not add a sortie. Operational movement only occurs in the operations phase. Unlike strategic movement, it costs movement points, and it may cost production points or add a sortie. 4.1 Strategic movement. Strategic movement allows one friendly supplied air or ground unit to move any distance along a contiguous transport line. 4.1.1 Strategic movement phase. In this phase, the phasing faction does the following. Step 1: if the home defense policy 10.3.1 is in effect, it checks to see if any friendly country is not satisfying that policy. If it is not, see home defense not satisfied 10.3.1.1. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx9. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. Step 2: it removes its strategic move marker, if any, from the map, and puts it in its faction cards events box. Step 3: if required as per scenario instructions, it removes any of its units or markers. Step 4: it may put its strategic move marker on one friendly, supplied air or ground unit in a hex containing a transport line. That hex can contain an adjacency. The unit then performs strategic movement 4.1.2. The strategic move marker stays on the unit until next turn. 4.1.2 Strategic movement procedure: a unit marked with strategic move may move any distance from hex to hex across hexides that are connected by a transport line. When done, keep the strategic move marker on the unit. Important: each hex entered must be able to trace a supply line 7.4 back to a supply source 7.3 for the unit. If the supply line is traced across a C-zone or map box, it cannot be intercepted, and the convoy used is not activated. Just confirm that a valid supply line can be traced. 4.1.3 Strategic movement prohibitions. A naval unit cannot use strategic movement. The unit cannot enter or cross a ground movement prohibited hex or hexide a player aid sheet movement. The unit cannot enter an enemy, city, fort, or adjacency. Per above, it can start in an adjacency. The movement cannot violate stacking limits. There is no strategic movement across a C-zone or map box. 4.1.4 Strategic movement unit limitations: a unit marked with the strategic move marker cannot be activated in its faction's actions subphase. It can be attacked or displaced in an enemy actions subphase. It suffers no combat penalty for having a strategic move marker. Cannot be improved in the replacements phase. Cannot be replaced in the upgrade phase. Cannot occupy a fort at the end of its movement. Strategic movement example: the turn is December 1941. The Axis strategic move marker is on a German ground unit in France. Things are going very badly for Axis Italy in the Mediterranean, so the Axis player wants to get German air down there quickly. First, the Axis faction removes its marker from the map and puts it in its faction cards events box. A German air unit is in hex 2951, and a USSR ground unit is in Kharkov. The Axis faction takes its strategic move marker and puts it on the Germany air unit. It can do this despite the USSR unit's EZOC, because it is starting the move in EZOC. After leaving its starting hex, the air unit is then moved along a contiguous transport line, avoiding any EZOC, all the way to Palermo in Sicily. The Axis strategic move marker remains on the air unit until the next turn's strategic move phase. Then the Western and Soviet factions do their strategic movement. 4.2 Operational movement. There are three types of operational movement: air 4.2.2, ground 4.2.3, and naval 4.2.4. Each one allows a supplied or unsupplied unit to move. All types of operational movement use the operational movement procedure listed below. However, each type also has specific rules found in their own section that need to be followed. Movement path trace. A game mechanic may require a unit to trace a movement path from one location to another without physically moving the counter. Unless stated otherwise, the path traced must follow the rules for the specified movement type. Movement points. With each activation, a unit receives a maximum number of movement points at MP that it can expend to move. The amount received depends on the unit, and its supply state is 7.1. Full supply, leg ground unit equals 8, all other units equals 10. Low or no supply, leg ground unit equals 4, all other units equals 5. Movement points cannot be saved from turn to turn. For .2.1 operational movement procedure, as a unit moves, it will pay an MP cost to enter or cross a hexide, hex, C-zone, or map box. A ground unit also pays an MP cost to attack an enemy ground unit, a 4.2.3.3. After a unit pays the MP cost, its total MP for the turn is reduced accordingly. The MP cost paid to move and attack is subtracted before the unit moves. If a unit does not have enough MP left to pay the total cost, it cannot move and attack into that location. Example, the weather is fair and the USSR 5-shock army has spent 6 of its 8 MP. It cannot attack an Italian ground unit in a clear hex across a river hexide, because the total movement point cost of 3 are 1 MP for clear hex, plus 1 MP for moving across a river hexide, and plus 1 MP for attacking a hex affected by fair weather that exceeds the shock army's remaining 2 MP. MP costs are on the player aid sheet's movement table. Only MP costs beginning with A+ are cumulative with other MP costs. Example, a ground unit moving across a river hexide a plus 1 MP into a hex with an enemy city, 2 MP, and rough terrain, a 2 MP, pays 3 movement points, not 5. For .2.2 air movement, an air unit can use air movement to move across hexes, or if stacked with a convoy unit, it can use naval transport as 6.4.4 to move within or between adjacent sea zones and or map boxes. A USSR air unit can use air movement to move between a USSR hex on the east map edge and the central Russia map box, and vice versa. Only an air unit can perform air movement. An air unit moves from hex to adjacent hex using the operational movement procedure 4.2.1. Important, air movement must end in a map box, in a friendly city, or in a hex containing a transport line, and no enemy unit or enemy marker. In addition, a supply line of 7.4 must be able to be traced from the ending location to a supply source for the unit. If tracing across a sea zone, the trace cannot be intercepted, and the convoy used is not activated. Just confirm that a valid supply line can be traced. This requirement limits movement ending behind enemy lines. Sorties, when the unit's movement is done, add 1 sortie to its total. Exception, an air unit using naval transport does not add 1 sortie if the convoy moving it was interdicted a 5.2.1. 10 Unconditional Surrender 2 Any edition use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. 4.2.2.1 Air Movement Prohibitions. A unit cannot enter an air movement prohibited hex. Player aid sheet, movement. A unit cannot end in a hex that violates stacking limits of 3.3. A unit cannot end in a hex containing an EZOC unless the hex contains a friendly, city, fort, or unit. A unit cannot end in a hex containing an enemy, city, fort, unit, airdrop, or partisan's marker. In the same activation, a unit cannot combine naval transport with hex to adjacent hex, or central Russia box for movement. 4.2.3 Ground Movement UC has an integrated movement and combat system. Basically, one ground unit moves and fights, sometimes multiple times, before the next ground unit moves and fights. A ground unit can use ground movement to move across hexes, or if stacked with a convoy unit, it can use naval transport as 6.4.4 to move within or between adjacent sea zones and or map boxes. Only a ground unit can perform ground movement. A ground unit can move from hex to adjacent hex using the operational movement procedure 4.2.1. A USSR ground unit can use ground movement to move between a USSR hex on the east map edge and the central Russia map box, and vice versa. For .2.3.1 ground movement EZOC restrictions, the following applies to a ground unit in an EZOC, including one that occupies a fort in an EZOC. Because these restrictions are important to how the game plays out, it is recommended you set up the example below on the map to physically go through it. A unit cannot move directly between hexes which contain an EZOC exerted by the same enemy unit. Example, the French 10 Army is in hex 2914, and the French 6 Army is in hex 3115. The German 2P Army starts its activation in hex 2915. The 2P Army cannot move from 2915 directly into 3014, then empty Paris, because the 10 Army exerts an adjacency in both hexes. At the start of its activation, a unit in an adjacency can move into a hex containing an adjacency exerted by a different unit, provided that move does not violate the same unit adjacency rule above. Example continued, the 2P Army can move from 2915 into 3015, as the adjacency in the 3015 does not belong to 10 Army. At the start of its activation, a unit in an adjacency can move into a hex containing no adjacency, and then later move into a hex containing an adjacency exerted by any unit, even the enemy unit that exerted the original adjacency. Example continued, the 2P Army can move from 2915 into 2815, which has no adjacency, and then into 2814, which has an adjacency. Very important, at any point during its activation, except at the start of its activation as per above, if a ground unit is in a hex containing an adjacency, it must do one of the following. End its activation. If the hex contains a fort of the same nationality, and the unit did not occupy the fort earlier in its activation, it may occupy the fort before ending its activation. If it has not performed a mobile attack in this activation, it can designate an assault of 5.3.3 against an adjacent enemy ground unit. If it designates an assault, the unit's activation ends. Remember to pay all the movement costs to designate the assault of 4.2.3.3. It can initiate a mobile attack of 5.3.2 against an adjacent enemy ground unit that does not occupy a fort of 4.2.3.5. It can do this even if it had resolved another mobile attack in the same activation, and even against the same enemy unit. Remember to pay all the movement costs for each mobile attack of 4.2.3.3. The basic concept of these restrictions is that except for a ground unit's initial move, if a ground unit finds itself in an adjacency, it must either end its activation or attack an adjacent enemy unit. An adjacency is very sticky in use. Example continued, the 2P Army starts its activation by resolving a mobile attack against 10 Army. The combat result was DR and Western faction retreats 10 Army into 2813, Calais. 2P performs an advance after combat into 2914. It is now in the adjacency of 10 Army in Calais. Since it is no longer the start of its activation, and 2P is in an adjacency from 10 Army in Calais, 2P must either end its activation or attack an adjacent ground unit. It cannot leave the adjacency to move into Paris. 2P continues its activation by attacking 10 Army in Calais. Example continued, alternatively, 2P does not advance after combat. By doing this, it is no longer in an adjacency and can continue its activation by moving into Paris. When it does, it is now in the adjacency of 6 Army, and so must either end its activation or attack the adjacent ground unit. 4.2.3.2 Ground Movement Prohibitions. A unit cannot enter or cross a ground movement prohibited hex or hexide. Player Aid Sheet, Movement. Unconditional Surrender 2nd Edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx11. Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. A unit cannot violate stacking limits, 3.3. A unit cannot enter a hex containing a friendly ground unit, and an adjacency. You can move through a friendly unit if there is no adjacency in its hex. In the same activation, a unit cannot combine hex to adjacent hex, or Central Russia box for movement with naval transport. 4.2.3.3 Ground movement, and attack at any point in its movement, any type of ground unit, for example, infantry, tank, full or reduced strength, field or garrison, supplied or unsupplied, etc., may do the following against an enemy ground unit in an adjacent hex that it can move into. It may initiate and resolve a mobile attack of 5.3.2. If it did not already initiate a mobile attack in its current activation, it may designate an assault attack of 5.3.3. Important, to initiate a mobile attack or designate an assault attack, the phasing unit must pay the full terrain cost to enter the defending hex plus the additional, attacking a unit. Movement point cost. This cost is paid before the attack is resolved. After paying the cost, the attacker does not move into the defender's hex. It will have the option to advance into the hex if it wins the combat, and the defender is no longer in the defending hex. Example continued, at the start of 2P Army's activation it had 10 movement points, because it is a mobile unit. To attack the 10 Army in hex 2914, 2P spent 3 MP, 1 for the defender's clear hex, plus 1 for the river hexide, and plus 1 for attacking a unit in a hex affected by fair weather. 2P remained in hex 2915, and resolved the mobile attack. 10 Army retreated into Calais, and 2P performed an advance. After combat into 2914, 2P continued its activation by attacking 10 Army in Calais. This attack cost 4 MP, 2 for the defender's hex that contains an enemy city, plus 1 for the river hexide, and plus 1 for attacking a unit in a hex affected by fair weather. 2P has 3 MP left out of its starting 10. Placing an assault marker on a phasing unit ends that unit's activation. Therefore, it cannot continue moving that phase. More than one unit can designate an assault against the same enemy ground unit. Example, the Soviet faction activates a USSR infantry unit, and moves it next to a German infantry unit. It has enough movement points left to attack into the German unit's hex, so it designates an assault by placing an assault marker on the USSR unit and pointing the marker's arrow to the defender's hex. The USSR infantry unit's activation ends. It could not do a mobile attack first, and then designate an assault. The Soviet faction then activates a guards unit, moves it adjacent to the same German unit, and designates an assault against it. The guards unit's activation is over. The Soviet faction does the same thing with a shock unit. The Soviet faction can choose to resolve the assault now or continue activating other units to do something else. When the Soviet faction wants to resolve the assault that phase, it declares it is doing so. For .2.3.4 transport line anytime during a unit's movement across hexes, it may use a transport line connecting the unit's current hex with an adjacent hex. While moving along a transport line, treat the terrain of the hex side being crossed and the hex being entered as clear terrain. A unit does not receive this benefit if it is moving or attacking into a hex containing an enemy, city, fort, or ground unit. A USSR unit does not receive this benefit if it is moving into out of the central Russia box. A unit not receiving this benefit ignores the transport line and pays full movement point costs. For .2.3.5 fort occupation, a brief list of fort effects is also in Fort 15.12. A ground unit must occupy a fort to receive its combat benefits as found on the player aid sheet's ground combat tables. An air or naval unit cannot occupy a fort. To show a unit occupies a fort, put it under the fort marker. A unit on top of a fort marker does not occupy that fort. A unit can choose to occupy a fort only while performing the Army Operations Action 6.3.1, Mobilization 8.3, or Country Setup 13.1.2. The decision to occupy a fort is made at the time a unit starts in, moves into, ends in, or is initially set up in a fort hex. The sole purpose of performing the Army Operations Action can be to simply occupy or exit a fort. A unit can choose to exit a fort only while performing the Army Operations Action 6.3.1, or a retreat 5.3.5. Occupying or exiting a fort, i.e., putting it under or on top of a fort marker, does not cost movement points. A unit occupying a fort in an adjacency is considered to be in an adjacency. An adjacency in a fort hex does not impact a unit's ability to occupy or exit a fort. Also, a unit that starts its activation by exiting a fort in an adjacency may continue to move per ground unit rules. While a unit is occupying a fort, it cannot attack an enemy unit. Therefore, a unit must first exit the fort before it can attack. For .2.3.6 fort occupation restrictions, only a ground unit of the same nationality as a fort can occupy it. Another friendly country's unit can be in the hex provided there is no other ground unit already in the hex, but it cannot occupy the fort. A unit occupying a fort cannot exit it and then occupy any fort in the same movement activation. Example, a French army occupies the Maginot Fort in Metz. It cannot move out of the fort, attack a German unit, and then occupy the Metz fort or any other Maginot Fort in that activation. Why not? Because we're not talking about 100 soldiers sallying forth from a castle. If an enemy unit moves into a hex containing a fort, remove that fort from the scenario. Exception, if Italy is an Axis country, and a Western ground unit enters Tobruk, flip the Italy Tobruk fort over to its UK Tobruk fort side. If an enemy unit enters the hex at a later time, the UK fort is removed from the scenario. The Tobruk fortifications proved much more useful to Commonwealth troops. For .2.3.7 air naval displacement, if a ground unit enters a hex containing an enemy air or naval unit, that enemy unit immediately moves out of the hex per air 4.2.2, or naval 4.2.4 movement rules. Exception, the unit cannot move using naval transport. The enemy unit moves even if it has 6 sorties. This movement cannot be intercepted, nor is the displaced unit considered activated because of it. 12 Unconditional Surrender 2 Any edition use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. The air or naval unit's faction moves it. Multiple enemy units in the entered hex may move to the same or different locations. When the displaced air or naval unit is done moving, if it has less than 6 sorties, add 1 sortie to its total. If the air or naval unit has no location where it can end its movement, remove its sorties and put it in its faction card's eliminated box. For .2.4 naval movement, only a naval unit can perform naval movement. A naval unit moves within or between adjacent sea zones and or map boxes using the operational movement procedure 4.2.1. Naval movement does not involve moving from hex to adjacent hex. The entirety of a map feature, for example, a sea zone, is considered one location. Example, a naval unit in Rotterdam that moves to Brest pays 3 movement points, 1 MP each for sea zones 11, 10, and 7. Note that moving into and out of the ports did not cost movement points. A player aid sheet, movement. Naval movement starts with a unit doing of one of the following. It moves into a sea zone that contains the port the unit occupies. This occurs even if it is only moving to an adjacent hex. Example, a unit in Rotterdam enters sea zone 11 or 1 MP, before it moves into Amsterdam. It moves through a canal from the port it occupies at one end of the canal to the port at the other end of the canal. Example, a unit in Port Said moves to Suez at 2 MP. It moves from a map box into an adjacent sea zone or map box. Unlike when counting a range of 1.4, you exclude the map box occupied by the unit. Example, a unit in the Eastern North America box can move into either the North Atlantic Ocean or South Atlantic Ocean box, 3 MP. After it starts moving as per the above, the naval unit can then continue to move into an adjacent sea zone or map box, move into a friendly port within its current sea zone, or use a canal. Important, naval movement must end in a friendly port. Use naval units do not remain out at sea. Sorties, when a naval unit's movement ends, if it did not fight an aired naval combat during its move, add 1 sortie to its total. 4.2.4.1 Naval Movement Prohibitions. A unit cannot enter or cross a naval movement prohibited hex or hexide a player aid sheet, movement. Exception, if the cooperation limits policy is in effect, a unit using a canal 4.2.4.2 can cross land hexes and or move into, but not end its movement in a different, active friendly country. A unit cannot end in a hex that violates stacking limits of 3.3. A unit cannot end in a hex containing an enemy, city, fort, unit, airdrop or partisan's marker. A unit cannot cross a strait if either of the hexes the strait symbol points to contains an enemy, city, fort, or unit. It also cannot cross a strait if both of the strait's hexes are in a neutral country or countries. A unit cannot use a canal if any of its hexides is adjacent to an enemy, city, fort, or unit. An Axis unit cannot enter a map box. An Axis or Western unit cannot enter the Central Russia box. A USSR unit cannot enter a map box except the Central Russia box. 4.2.4.2 Canal. A canal allows naval movement across land hexes between sea zones. To use a canal, the unit either starts, or moves into, a port at one end of the canal, and is then placed in the port at the other end of the same canal. It may then continue moving. 4.2.4.3 Map box. 2 map boxes are adjacent if they share an arrow that points to each other. A map box is adjacent to a sea zone if its sea zone number is listed in that map box. 4.2.4.4 Strait. The cost to cross a strait hexide is paid for each such hexide crossed, and only if crossing is required to make the movement. Examples, a naval unit in Istanbul that moves to Samsun does not pay for crossing the strait pointing to Istanbul. If it moves from Istanbul to Athens, it pays to cross one strait in hexes 41414241. A naval unit moving from Athens to Sevastopol pays for crossing 2 straits. 5.0 Combat. The combat resolution sequence is simple despite the number of steps. You should remember it after a few combats. Unconditional Surrender 2nd edition, Use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx13. Copyright symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC Living Rules Designers Edition. There are 3 types of combat: air, naval, ground, and strategic. They are discussed in more detail later in this rules section. The attacker in a combat is the faction that initiated it. Example, a phasing Italian convoy unit is moving, and the Western faction intercepts it with a non-phasing UK warship unit. The UK unit is the attacker. A combat can involve only 2 factions at a time. The third faction cannot commit anything to influence the combat. If a combat is initiated by an attacker, the defender must participate. Note that an assault ground combat of 5.3.3 can be designated, but need not be initiated. If not initiated, it is not fought. Example, a phasing German air unit declares an airstrike against a UK air unit. The defending UK unit must participate in the combat. The same combat resolution sequence 5.1 and combat results table. The CT are used to resolve all types of combat. However, each type of combat has its own die roll modifiers, a DM list, and its own combat results list. The combat results table and the specific combat results lists are different things. All combat lists and tables are on the player aid sheet. 5.1 Combat resolution sequence. Use the following sequence to determine the result of any type of combat. If a step does not apply in the combat fought, skip it. Step 1 The ground combat only. If it is a mobile attack, the attacking unit is the primary attacker. If it is an assault attack involving multiple attacking units, the attacker declares one unit as the primary attacker and up to 2 others as additional attacker units. Step 2 Each side uses a will not commit marker to secretly decide if it commits any of the following to the combat. Both sides then simultaneously reveal their choice. Any number of event markers of 14.0, as per their rules. Ground combat only, 1 air unit. If a side reveals will not commit, it cannot commit anything to the combat, even if the other side does. If a side reveals will commit, it must commit at least 1 eligible event marker or air unit to the combat. If both sides reveal will commit, start with the attacker. Each side alternates declaring 1 event marker or air unit to be committed. Continue this until both sides consecutively stop committing. As long as one side commits, the other side can also, even if it did not commit something earlier. Step 3 The ground combat only. If both sides committed an air unit, temporarily stop the ground combat sequence. Resolve an air-naval combat between the air units to determine which side might apply the air support ground combat DM. The ground combat attacker is also the attacker in the air-naval combat. After the air-naval combat has been resolved, continue the ground combat with Step 4. Step 4 Each side determines its own die roll modifiers as per the die roll modifiers list for the type of combat fought. After adding all modifiers for a side, the maximum DM that can be applied to that side is and or 10. Do not combine both sides' modifiers, and apply the result to only one side. For example, if the attacker has a +2 DM, and the defender has a -1 DM, it is not applied as a +1 DM. The CT results are not strictly linear. Step 5 Each side rolls 1 die, and applies its own DM to the result. Each side then checks the die roll modifiers list under, after rolling combat die to see if it divides its modified result by 2. Round up after each division. A final modified value less than 1 is treated as 1. Step 6. On the combat results table, cross-reference the attacker's final value across the top with the defender's final value down the side. Look up the found CRE result on the respective combat results list for the type of combat fought, and apply that result. Combat resolution sequence example. A German tank unit initiates an assault attack against a reduced USSR infantry unit in a city hex affected by poor weather. Each side has several air units all with less than 6 sorties within 5 hexes of the defender's hex. Step 1. The German tank unit is the primary attacker. Step 2. Each side takes a will not commit marker. The Axis faction wants to commit the air unit, so it secretly places the will commit side face up and covers it with his hand. The Soviet faction wants to commit an air unit and a tank's event marker, so it does the same thing with its will not commit marker. Together, they both reveal their choices. The Axis faction starts by declaring it is committing an air unit. The Soviet faction does likewise. At this point, no more air units can be committed because only one per side is allowed in a combat. The Axis faction then says it is not committing. The Soviet faction then commits the tank's event marker. The Axis faction could now commit an event marker if it had one it could use, but chooses not to and states so. The Soviet faction also states it is not committing. Since both sides did not commit consecutively, no more commitments can be made. Step 3. Because both sides committed an air unit, an air-naval combat is fought between the air units, with the Axis unit being the attacker in this battle as well. The air-naval combat goes through its own combat resolution sequence to determine the number of sorties added to each air unit, and which side receives the air support ground combat DM. For this example, the air-naval combat resulted in both sides applying the air support ground combat DM to the ground combat. Step 4. Each side determines its own applicable ground combat die roll modifiers. The final Axis DM is +1/+2 for a Germany unit, +1 air support in poor, +1 tank unit in poor, -1 for attacking a unit in a hex affected by poor weather, and -1 for attacking a city. The final Soviet DM is 0 +1 air support in poor, +1 tank unit in poor, due to the tank's event marker, and -2 for being reduced. Step 5 for the Axis faction's die roll result was 3, to which it adds the Axis +1 DM, for a final modified result of 4. The Soviet faction's die roll result was 6, to which nothing is added. Step 6. The attacker's final result of 4 is found across the top of the combat results table, and then cross-referenced down the column with the defender's final result of 6. The combat result is AS +2. Since it is a ground combat, the +2 part of the result is ignored. The result is AS. The AS result is then located on the player aid. 14. Unconditional Surrender 2. Any edition use 2 Rulebook SV the 31st of August 2020 v03.docx. Living Rules Designers Edition Copyright Symbol 2014, 2017 GMT Games, LLC. Sheets Ground Combat Results Table. The AS or attacker stopped result ends the German tank unit's activation for the turn. The combat is over, and the heroes of the Soviet Union have turned back the German panzers. 5.2 Air naval combat. An air naval combat is fought between air and or naval units. It occurs in the operations phase due to the following actions: air strike as 6.2.2, air support as 6.2.3, air interception as 6.2.5, carrier strike as 6.4.5, or naval interception as 6.4.3. The combat is resolved using the combat resolution sequence 5.1.5.2.1. Air naval combat results. After determining the CT result, perform the 2 steps listed on the player aid sheet's air naval combat results list. Based on the CT result, step 1 will add sorties to the attacking and defending units. Also based on the CT result, step 2 determines the effect on the action that initiated the combat, for example, if both sides committed an air unit to a ground combat, which sides receive the air support. DIM. Air naval combat example: a UK fighter with 1 sortie in Malta intercepts an Italian convoy with no sorties that moved from Catania into Sea Zone 22. The Axis faction wants it to go to Tripoli. To resolve the interception, an air naval combat is fought. The UK fighter is the attacker because it initiated the combat. After following the combat resolution sequence and rolling the dice, the CRT result is DR +2. On the air naval combat results list, the DR result is found under step 1, sorties. The DR result, as well as a DD or D result, states the attacker adds 1 sortie, and the defender adds sorties equal to the and hash part of the CT result. The UK fighter adds 1 sortie, bringing its total to 2. The Italian convoy adds 2 sorties, bringing its total to 2. After applying the sorties, the factions look at step 2, effect. Since the combat was against a unit performing naval movement, the 4th bullet applies. It states look below at the interdiction section of the air naval combat results list. The DR result, as well as a DD or D result, states the interdiction was successful. Looking at what was interdicted, i.e., naval movement, the Italian convoy unit's activation ends. The Italian convoy must now move to the nearest port based on movement point costs. In this situation, because Tripoli is also in Sea Zone 22, and it does not cost anything more to move into a port, the Italian convoy is placed in Tripoli, which was the Axis faction's goal in the first place. This example also served the purpose of illustrating that even if naval movement is successfully interdicted, it is possible for it to make it to its destination, provided that it is not farther away from another friendly port. 5.2.2 Escorted Unit Air Naval Combat. If a unit attacks an enemy convoy unit that is being escorted by an air unit to 6.2.4 and or a naval unit to 6.4.2, and the escort has less than 6 sorties, first resolve a combat between the attacking unit and the escort. If there is more than one escort, the defender decides which escort it will fight first. If the air naval combat result is escort failed, and the attacking unit has less than 6 sorties, it may choose to attack again.